Thanks for letting me into your sitting rooms and kitchens this evening. Hello to those of us who are joining us by phone. There might be some that are dialing in. Hello to you. It still seems strange speaking to a screen after all these weeks. We're going through the book of James. If you're with us tonight for the first time, we're looking at chapter 5, and it's verses 1 to 11. James, as we've learned in these past couple of weeks, he doesn't pull any punches, does he? He just says things how they are. He doesn't mince any of his words. And this section is no different. It's split into two parts. The first section, 1 to 6, is looking at how the rich act and how they treat the poor. And the second part, which is verse 7 to 11, that's going to be talking about patience and perseverance. I'm just going to pray again before we start. Lord, thank you again that we can come before you, and just thank you that we can open your word together and study this sometimes hard-hitting book of James. Pray that you'll let us all come away from this evening having learnt something new, and for you having to have spoken to each one of us. Pray for me that you'll help me get across what you want me to say. Ask for your help this evening now. Amen. Amen. Mark, do you mind putting the verses that we're looking at tonight on the screen, please? So hopefully everyone then can see the verses that we're going to be looking at. And then once they're on the screen, I'll just read through them for us.
Mark, I've had to change laptops at last minute, so I'll put them up in just a moment, but carry on, yeah?
Yeah, no worries. Okay. I'm sure a lot of you've got Bibles, so I'll just start reading through, like Mark said. James 5, 1 to 11. Now listen, you rich people, weep and wail because of the misery that is coming on you. Your wealth has rotted and moths have eaten your clothes. Your gold and silver are corroded. Their corrosion will testify you and eat your flesh like fire. You've hoarded wealth in the last days. Look, the wages you failed to pay the workers who mowed your fields are crying out against you. The cries of the harvesters have reached the ears of the Lord Almighty. You have lived on earth in luxury and self-indulgence. You have fatted yourselves in the day of slaughter. You have condemned and murdered the innocent one who was not opposing you. Be patient then, brothers and sisters, until the Lord's coming. See how the farmer waits for the land to yield its valuable crop, patiently waiting for the autumn and spring rains. You too be patient and stand firm, because the Lord's coming is near. Don't grumble against one another, brothers and sisters, or you will be judged. The judge is standing at the door. Brothers and sisters, as an example of patience in the face of suffering, take the prophets who spoke in the name of the Lord. As you know, we count as blessed those who have persevered. You've heard of Job's perseverance and have seen what the Lord finally brought about. The Lord is full of compassion and mercy. Cheers, Mark. Okay, we've got James spending the first 6 verses of this chapter giving a stark warning to the rich. But before we carry on, we need to be clear here that James isn't teaching against being rich. There's nothing wrong with having money. James is speaking against how you use your money and how you've earned it. And James is giving us a warning here of what we're investing in, what we're relying on. The rich or the non-Christians are depending on wealth and status to get them through life. Security is seen in having money, isn't it? And having great importance that's placed on money. But James sees through all this, and he says that this should not be the case. He's already referred to in chapter 1 that someone who is materially poor but has a faith in God is rich. Likewise, those who are rich on earth but don't know God, they're poor. And James is repeating the exact teaching of Jesus in Matthew chapter 6, 19. He says, do not store up for yourselves treasures on earth. The world will soon pass away, and we're again being reminded tonight that it's Jesus that we need to invest in. It's Jesus that we need to spend our time on. It's Jesus and work for him that we should be spending our resources on. John the Baptist, he also warned where we place our faith as well. The religious leaders of the day back then, they relied on their traditions, didn't they? They relied on their nationality to get them into heaven. And he says in Matthew 3 of the Lord gathering his wheat into the barn and burning up the chaff with an unquenchable fire. Now the wheat signifies the Christians and the chaff are the people who put their emphasis on other things. The chaff that will amount to nothing is the reliance on the material wealth. And I just want to ask ourselves this evening: what chaff are we involved with at the moment? There's nothing wrong, is there, with an interest or a hobby, but does that hobby take up too much of our time? Are we getting caught up in something that is getting in the way of God? What are we spending our resources on? What chaff have we got in our lives? When Joseph was in Egypt and he'd revealed himself to his brothers, he wanted to bring his father Jacob down into Egypt. And Pharaoh told Joseph to give his family some carts to bring their things back. And I like what is said in Genesis 45, verse 20, if you want to read it afterwards. Pharaoh says, "Never mind about your belongings, because the best of all Egypt will be yours." So Pharaoh wanted to give his best to Jacob. He knew that whatever Jacob had, he could offer immeasurably more. The AB says this: "Also regard not your stuff, for the good of all the land of Egypt is yours." I just like the word Pharaoh used, that word stuff, to dismiss all of Jacob's wealth. And that word stuff just made me think, what stuff have we accumulated that we're now becoming too attached to? James is reminding us that our stuff is of little value when you compare with what God has to offer us. And perhaps tonight we need to reassess what stuff takes up our time. Is it worthwhile? Is it God-focused? Or is it just chaff stuff that's eventually going to get blown away and amount to nothing in the end? James is speaking about hoarding. He says, your wealth has rotted. In Bible times, wealth was measured by money, but also grain, your harvest, and oil was also an indicator of money. Verse 2 says, your wealth has rotted. It says the grain, or it could say the grain in your barns have gone mouldy. The oils that you haven't used, they spoiled. Remember the Good Samaritan who poured oil on the man's wounds? The inference there that this was an expensive commodity that was given freely. Mary poured expensive perfume on Jesus' feet. Again, the example here is of her not holding back. Mary was generous with the possessions that we had, and we're not to accumulate past our point of need. Moths have eaten your clothes, he says. Clothing in James's day, and it still is in ours, it's a sign of wealth, isn't it? James speaks strongly here against the misuse of material possessions. Moths, they don't eat clothes that are being worn, do they? They only eat clothes that are being stored. Perhaps this is James speaking out against owning Christmas jumpers, I don't know. But if we're not wearing clothes we own, why do we own them? You've hoarded wealth in your last days. How many of us have got clothes tucked away in our wardrobe that we never wear? And if we're not wearing them, we need to give them away, don't we? We're not using them. As most of you know, I hate waste. I hate seeing things being thrown away that I know could be used again. Every time I go to the tip, I feel like crying because I see what people have thrown away that could be fixed or that could be donated to a charity shop. But then I'm just as guilty because I've got clothes that are folded away at home that I never wear, and they're just as good as wasted as well, aren't they? So could this be a challenge that perhaps we go away with tonight? It's not a deep thought really, but it's a practical way that we can live out James's teaching. After this, perhaps we'll clear out our clothes that we never wear, put them in a pile, and then once lockdown eases, we can give them to the Paradise Run. Or if they're not suitable for Paradise Run, then give them to a charity shop. We don't want to be guilty, do we, of verse 3, hoarding wealth in the last days. Owning a camper van means that I'm well aware of corrosion. I'm currently in a rust battle that I'm very much losing. James says that corrosion will testify against you. Every time I look at the panels on my van, I can see that it's slowly rusting away. No amount of polish can hide the rust on my van. The days are numbered, lover. But nothing lasts, does it? And this is what James is speaking about here. I thought it was interesting to read that James says that gold and silver have corroded. Your gold and silver have corroded. But why does James say this when we all know, and James knows, that silver and gold, it doesn't rust? So I was thinking, is James making a mistake here? Gold and silver is the best this world has to offer, isn't it? It's the true measure of value, and it does last forever. Yet James is saying, in heaven, this is worthless. The best that we have to offer, the best this world has to offer, is nothing compared to heaven, is it? It lasts for a long time in this world, but James has already told us that this world's like a mist compared to the time spent in eternity. So it turns out that gold doesn't really last long at all, does it? If gold is the best we can offer, what did heaven offer for us? The best, isn't it? We who produce no worth, who are seen as invaluable to God. Remember tonight all the riches that we've been brought into as we go into communion later. Let's not cling on to the gold, but focus on his worth. It's only his worth, isn't it, that allows us to spend an eternity with him. I got the impression that James is on a bit of a roll now, because he barely stops for breath before he launches against corruption in employment. He seems to go straight into it. And I got a sense that James was really in touch with the marginalised of society back then. He really seems to know what is going on with the issues of the poor. James knows that there's an issue with the labourers not getting paid, and he speaks out against this, doesn't he? Verse 4, the wages you failed to pay the workmen are crying out against you. And there's situations that are referred to in the Bible which we can't appreciate, and we say that these are cultural, like foot washing, for example. We don't do it, so we see that as a cultural thing, don't we? In Bible times, a woman's testimony was not seen as valid as a man's. It's not the case today, so we look on that as a cultural thing. And we say this to help us see the difference, don't we, between what happened then and what happens now. But verses 4 to 6 are definitely not cultural. We might think that it's impossible not to be paid what we've earned. What boss or manager wouldn't pay us our wage? We can't see it as right, can we? But verse 4, it's as relevant today as the day James wrote it. Let me read you some facts that I've found on the internet. 40 million people worldwide are estimated to be in slavery. 1 in 4 of those are children, and 71% are women and girls. And then closer to home, in the UK, 10,000 people were referred to the authorities here in 2019 in relation to slavery and being forced to work against their will. And I've taken this from antislavery.org. And these are bad, frightening statistics, aren't they? The website is actually quite a harrowing read, as there are accounts on there from freed slaves who talk about their past experiences. The act of exploiting the poor and defrauding the weak is just as prevalent with James as it is with us today, isn't it? These facts prove that. James reminds us, though, that God knows what's going on. He's well aware of the plights of these people. He's not deaf to their pleas. He will avenge what is happening. Romans 12:19 says this, do not take revenge, my dear friends, but leave room for God's wrath. For it is written, it is mine to avenge, I will repay, says the Lord. And Paul's quoting Deuteronomy there, in relation to those verses. And reading verse 4 now of James, of someone crying out to the Lord, reminded me of Gethsemane, remembering how the Lord was burdened with the thoughts of Calvary, wasn't he? And he was reduced to tears. He was flat out on his face, pleading for a way out of the situation, wasn't he? May this cup be taken from me. Yet the resolution that the Lord would have preferred as a man, it didn't come, did it? The anguish he must have felt, knowing what was about to happen, seeing everything ahead of him as clear as day. Maybe we could remember that scene as we take the bread and wine later. But slavery is a massive issue, isn't it, that affects millions worldwide, as we've just found out. We could ask, why doesn't the Lord intervene? Why can't the Lord address this slavery issue then? Why didn't he address it now? It's not for us to question, is it, how the Lord works? Sin is in this world, and we're all experiencing it in one way or another. But this then ties into the patience that we read about later. The Lord will avenge this sin. He will avenge it, but avenge it in his time, not our time, so where our patience has to come in. In the meantime, we are to display this patience, aren't we? We're to persevere through the injustices that we see today. We're assured, though, that he does hear our cries. The Lord is completely aware of what is going on in his world. And we can only pray, can't we, and add our cries, the cries of the thousands of other people that we know that are praying for the same sort of thing. We know that they do reach the ears of the Lord Almighty. And it's a practical book, James, and the way to practically help the slavery issue, if we feel, oh, what can we do, is to read up on it and get involved in ways to stop it. So if you want to read more, it's antislavery.org if you want to see how you can help out there in a practical way. As a way of applying these verses to us, I was thinking, if we're an employer, do we pay our staff a fair wage for the work they do for us? Or if we're an employee, do we submit our travel expenses forms? Do we do that with a clear conscience? Do we work with the same diligence perhaps when our manager's out of the office to when they're stood behind us? Or if we're self-employed, do we earn our salary honestly when we fill out our tax returns? Do we do this in an honest way? There's some of the ways we can perhaps apply them to us today, those verses. With all this dishonesty and ungodly living going around, James probably realised that this must be frustrating and trying our patience. So to help us understand this patience that James wants us to display, he gives us an example that we can all relate to, doesn't he? He tells us about the farmer in verse 7. And the reader, whether back then in James's day or today, they would understand the concept of farming, wouldn't they? They must be the most patient people around, farmers, because they plant a seed, but they don't expect it to show the next day, do they? The boys planted some lettuce seed at the beginning of lockdown, and they expected it to be in a salad by the following lunchtime. It doesn't happen. They didn't have the patience that farmers have. But let's not lose sight of why we're patient, though. See how the crop is described in verse 7. It's described as valuable. We're waiting for something that is invaluable. We're waiting for his return. I was going to say you can't put a price on this return, but you can. The cost of this return was Jesus' blood, wasn't it? We are the valuable crop that helped Jesus endure the pain and the patience that he displayed in Gethsemane. And this should focus us, shouldn't it? This should make us all sit up, because we are waiting for a valuable, priceless event, aren't we? An event that will make all our persecutions worthwhile. Let me read Romans chapter 8, which says this: I consider that our present sufferings are not worth comparing with the glory that will be revealed in us. James is saying, look beyond that small patch of earth that holds this seed. Look to when you'll be harvesting in this valuable crop that it's going to produce. He's telling us really to play the long game. It's easy to say that when there's so much suffering around, but we are to keep our eyes on this prize. Let me read you the Message version of 1 Thessalonians. And then this: we can tell you with complete confidence, we've got the Master's word on it, that when the Master comes again to get us, those of us who are still alive will not get a jump on the dead and leave them behind. In actual fact, they'll be ahead of us. The Master himself will give the command, archangel thunder, God's trumpet blast. He'll come down from heaven, and the dead in Christ will rise. They'll go first. Then the rest of us who are still alive at the time will be caught up with them into the clouds to meet the Master. And we'll be walking on air. And then there'll be one huge family reunion with the Master. So reassure one another with these words. Good encouragement there, isn't it? Stand firm, because the Lord's coming is near. It will happen. It has to happen, because he's promised it, hasn't he? James must have a good handle on how we are as people. Verse 9, as you read through it, it just seems like a little footnote, but it says, don't grumble against each other, brothers. He's saying, I'm paraphrasing, by the way, while waiting for the Lord, cut some slack for those other Christians that are in the queue as well. There's other people. And I don't know if you've noticed the sign as you walk around shops that say, we're all in this together. In other words, don't get angry with staff or don't get angry with each other, because COVID is our common enemy, isn't it? Not each other. That's what the sign is trying to get across to us. And James is reminding us Christians the same sort of thing. We're all in this together. I know that I must have annoyed people since the time I've joined Bethesda. And I'm glad everyone's on mute, so I can't hear your agreements. But Satan, not COVID, is our common enemy, isn't it? And this echoes what Tristan said last week in chapter 4. Don't slander each other. We've all got bigger battles to fight, haven't we, with a bigger enemy, rather than moaning about each other. It's each other that we need to help in our patience in waiting for him. Moving on then, James gives us two other examples of patience in the face of suffering and perseverance. He mentions the prophets in verse 10, and then if you look at verse 11, he mentions Job. And Jesus refers to the Old Testament prophets as well in his sermons, doesn't he? The Hebrew writer in chapter 11, he goes into massive detail about people in the Old Testament and how they suffered and they enjoyed hardship. And James now does the same. So we hold these Old Testament people, don't we, in deep respect for the trials that they went through. The amazing thing, though, is that when we finally get to heaven, it'll be the Lord that shows us his respect for the faithfulness that we've shown. It'll go completely full circle or turn on its head. If you read Matthew chapter 10, it says, whoever acknowledges me before others, I will also acknowledge before my Father in heaven. So when you finally get to heaven, the Lord might refer to a situation that happened to you 30 years ago, or you might bring up how you handle an issue in, say, 3 months' time. Everything we do is seen by him. The perseverance that you've shown over the years, it's known to him, isn't it? The quiet suffering that you've endured, it's actually valued by him. But nothing escapes his notice, and he will bless you for that. James then uses Job in verse 11 as an example of patience and perseverance, and he reminds us of what the end result was. But what does James mean when he says, you've seen what the Lord finally brought about at the end of verse 11? And I was thinking about that, and Helen doesn't mind me saying this, but I don't know if you remember, it was powerful when Helen spoke a few months back and told us of the issues she faced with her mental health. Helen said that after all her suffering and anxiety, she'd rather endure her mental illness again, now knowing God better for it, than not having had a mental illness and not now having the closer experience that she has with God now. And that speaks volumes, doesn't it? That is a life experience of suffering and perseverance. You can't deny that. The suffering that Helen experienced has proved a verse, though, in the Hebrews chapter 12. It says this, no discipline seems pleasant at the time, but painful. Later on, however, it produces a harvest of righteousness and peace for those who've been trained by it. And I think Helen would agree with that. I was reading an article on Sir Ranulph Fiennes. He's the great British explorer. He's led countless expeditions to places that we've probably never even heard of. He's been to both poles. He's climbed Everest. He's ticked every box going. He's done it all, really. And this article was saying how Sir Ranulph was reading a book by Bear Grylls, who used to go to Eton School, the same as Sir Ranulph. And Bear wrote that he used to climb the old roofs, or the roofs of the school for fun. Bear Grylls said that when he was at the bottom of the famous domed roof at Eton, he was about to climb it, he saw Ranulph's name scratched into the brickwork with a knife. And Bear Grylls was saying that it must have been easier to climb the roof in Fiennes' day, as the school has since put up barbed wire around the base of the dome. And Sir Ranulph said that he'd wished he'd had the barbed wire in his day, as it would have made the climb of the domed roof even easier. Notice how Bear Grylls and Sir Ranulph, they both viewed that same situation differently. Bear Grylls saw this barbed wire as a hindrance, didn't he? Something to avoid. Yet Sir Ranulph, he saw that sharp barbed wire as an assistance. He saw the barbed wire as a benefit. He saw it as something to grab hold of and make use of to reach his goal. And I think this is what James is telling us. View your hardship, perhaps see the barbed wire in your life as a benefit. I'd suggest that James is perhaps asking us tonight to persevere in our situation, maybe turn what looks bad into a help. In answer to this question I asked, I think what James means when he says you've seen what the Lord finally brought about is that Job, he had a much closer relationship with the Lord after his suffering. 2 Corinthians says this, for this light momentary affliction is preparing for us an eternal weight of glory, beyond all comparison, as we look not to the things that are seen, but to things that are unseen. For the things that are seen are transient, but the things that are unseen are eternal. So yes, Job was given more materially after his suffering, but it was the deeper relationship born out of the patience shown through his perseverance that was his ultimate gain, wasn't it? Helen can testify to the fact that she now has a deeper relationship with God since the suffering that she's endured. I was wondering, we're able to look back tonight, we're able to see how we've learned from what should have been a hindrance. Can you see how you've developed as a result? The Lord is wanting to bless us, isn't he? Just as he blessed the Old Testament prophets, just as he blessed Job. We've all got barbed wire in our lives, haven't we? Are we able to turn that hard, sharp, uncomfortable issue into perhaps a stepping stone towards God? at the time, Helen and even others now might not see an end to their situation. But reading these verses, notice the encouragement that's tucked away. Look how we can take reassurance in the sufferings that we're going through now. If you notice verse 8, you'll see the Lord's coming is near. And if you go to the end of verse 11, it says, you've seen what the Lord finally brought about. See how those verses, they refer to a point where our patience and perseverance will end. The Lord will come. There will be an end to the patience that we've got to show. The Lord finally brought about Job's suffering, didn't he? It had an end point. So I was thinking, folks, if we're suffering, it's limited, it's finite. The suffering that we're enduring today will end. Let me read that verse again. For this momentary affliction is preparing for us an eternal weight of glory beyond all comparison, as we look not to the things that are seen, but the things that are unseen. For the things that are seen are transient, but the things that are unseen are eternal. Paul's encouraging us by describing life as just momentary. You may be suffering right now more than any of us might ever know, but can you just be encouraged tonight that if you are, it will pass, it will end. There's a finite point to it. That's all really I've got to say on this section. I hope you've all been able to take something from what we've read from James tonight. He was a practical bloke, and hopefully it'll give us some practical ways to live out our faith today. Let's not hoard, let's not argue, let's be patient with each other, let's persevere until the valuable crop, our Redeemer, shows himself and takes us to be with him. We're going to go into communion now, but before I do, read the end of verse 11, please. It says this: the Lord is full of compassion and mercy. James is someone who had first-hand dealings with the Lord. As the half-brother of Jesus, he'd grown up with him, hadn't he? He'd had many shared experiences with Jesus. As James grew up, though, so did his realization and understanding of who the Lord actually was. James went from a skeptic to an unbeliever to someone who's led to write these words: the Lord is full of compassion and mercy. And we're like James, aren't we, tonight? We've all come to a realization, to an understanding of who the Lord is. We've all experienced the Lord in one way or another. We can each say tonight that the Lord is full of compassion and mercy. John, he touched on these words, same words this morning, didn't he? In Exodus, Yahweh, the Lord, the God of compassion and mercy. We're all on this Zoom meeting because we want to follow the command Jesus gave. We want to remember the death, remember the resurrection of the person who is full of compassion and mercy. To lead us into worship, to help our worship this evening, I've got a song which I'd like Mark to play if he's got a minute, and then once that song finishes, Jonathan, do you mind giving thanks for the bread? Cheers, Mark.